When war erupted in Europe in 1914, and for the first time highly industrialized nations confronted one another in battle with the full might of modern weaponry, the result was inertia, trench warfare, the warfare of attrition. With few exceptions, towns were not fought through. They became hapless targets of immense artillery duels and barrages. This is the town of Cambrai in 1917. Only in that year, and then only briefly, did the newly invented tank begin to demonstrate the mobility in battle that was to take the next great confrontation between the European powers into the streets of their cities and towns. It was in the Second World War that urban fighting first became an integral part of modern warfare. And three actions in particular provide lessons which are still relevant to the techniques of fighting in built-up areas. Blitzkrieg, a ruthless use of modern weaponry, exploiting its mobility and firepower to devastate cities, terrify civilian populations, and overwhelm nations, enabling Hitler's armies to sweep through Europe almost unopposed. Immediately war was declared, the men and equipment of the British Expeditionary Force had begun moving to France. France had mobilized 100 divisions to counter the expected invasion by Germany through the Low Countries. The BEF comprised another 10 divisions. 40 of the French divisions manned the Maginot Line, and 5 more guarded the border with Switzerland. Another 40, including the BEF and the best trained and equipped of the French forces, were to advance into neutral Belgium as soon as Germany attacked. But when that happened, on the 10th of May 1940, the Germans made the pivot of their attack here, in the Ardennes, where they faced only the lightest of opposition. On May the 13th, the 4th day of the attack, the River Meuse was crossed near Sedan, and the spirit of the French High Command was broken by the speed and ferocity of the German advance. A British counterattack south of Arras failed to stop the Germans sweeping towards the Channel, and there was no recourse for the BEF but withdrawal to the coast before they were cut off and surrounded. The Channel ports now assumed a new and vital significance. Calais was to be held at all costs as a shield for the evacuation of the beleaguered British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk. Thus it was in Calais in May 1940 that fighting in built-up areas became for the first time an inescapable factor confronting British troops hurriedly ferried across the Channel to defend the town and halt the German advance. The old town of Calais grew up around the basins and docks of the harbour. A system of canals separates it from the rest of the town lying to the south. In 1940, many of Calais' centuries-old perimeter fortifications were still intact. Adjoining the old town to the west is the massive citadel, considered by many to be impregnable even in 1940. At that time, its moated ramparts protected a substantial military complex of barracks and other buildings. On the 22nd of May, as the German 2nd Armoured Division was closing in on Boulogne and the 1st Armoured Division was moving north, hurriedly embarking for Calais at Dover was the 3rd Battalion Royal Tank Regiment.
We left Fordingbridge, where we'd been stationed for 3 months, on a train at midnight, arriving at Dover at 8 o'clock on the following morning, to be greeted at the station by some scruffy Guards soldiers who were getting out of a train on the opposite platform, who asked us where we were going. When we replied Calais, we said, "Don't think much of that, mate. We've just been kicked out of Boulogne by the Germans." We also brought a copy of the Daily Mirror, which showed what the situation was in France. And when we went to the Lord Warden Hotel for briefing by the War Office representative, his briefing was exactly the same as had been in the Daily Mirror. We then embarked in one of the ferry boats, and there in the distance to the south we could see plumes of smoke, so we knew we were in for something. Now this was a very unexpected move, as we had been expecting to go to Cherbourg to train to join the BEF.
On that same day, Wednesday the 22nd of May, the 1st Battalion, Queen Victoria's Rifles, was also landed at Calais. The QVRs were a front-line territorial motorcycle battalion. They now formed the spearhead of 30 Brigade, whose job it was to secure Calais and halt the German advance.
When we left Dover, we had left all our motorcycles behind. We took the 2-inch mortars, but there were no mortar bombs for them. There was some smoke, I believe. There was a pride of the battalion, 1 3-inch mortar. That never got to Calais. So I think I'm right in saying that 1/3 of the battalion, their weapon was only a pistol. That was the drivers of the motorcycles and combinations. We had no pistol ammunition.
The QVR's orders were to establish roadblocks on all routes into Calais, whilst 3 RTR was to move to the southeast to secure the town of Saint-Omer.
By about midday on the 23rd, half the regiment tanks were ready to roll, and we set out towards Saint-Omer, and after about 7 miles, approaching a town called Guisnes, it was quite clear that there were a large column of enemy vehicles in front of us on the outskirts of the Forêt de Guisnes. In short, a fairly intensive battle took place here, in which quite a lot of German vehicles were destroyed, but the regiment lost something of the order of 12 tanks. And it might perhaps be interesting to mention at this stage that for the A9s and 10s, which were new tanks in the headquarters, we only had practice ammunition, which we watched bouncing off the German tanks. As a result of this, the colonel decided to withdraw to a ridge to the west of Calais, at a place called Coquelles.
Not far away, guarding the road into Calais from the village of Frétin, was a platoon of the Queen Victoria's Rifles commanded by Lieutenant Raymond Snowden. His position in the vicinity of the town's principal marshalling yard had enabled him to block the Frétin road with a train.
On the evening of the 23rd, we considered ourselves very well placed. I had my 3 sections nicely spaced out, and I had a couple of Belgian machine guns, which I thought was very nice, and I had this anti-tank rifle. I had a nice roadblock, and I had another really strong roadblock of the train about half a mile behind me, and I was really pretty pleased with myself.
By this time, the evening of Thursday, the 23rd of May, the dock area around the Gare Maritime was busy with the arrival of the main body of 30 Brigade under the command of Brigadier Claude Nicholson. 30 Brigade comprised the 2nd Battalion, the King's Royal Rifle Corps, the 60th, and the 1st Battalion, Rifle Brigade, together with the 1st Battalion, Queen Victoria's Rifles, already in positions on the roads leading into the town. Brigadier Nicholson's orders on arrival were to operate offensively in the direction of Boulogne.
However, I think he quickly realised from reports coming in from 3rd Tanks, who were deployed south of Calais, and from the general sounds of battle and other intelligence that was reaching him, that it was going to be beyond his means, really, to carry out an offensive operation down to Boulogne, and anyway, before he did anything, the right thing was to establish a firm base in Calais.
In 1940, Brigadier Grisman Davis Schofield was a subaltern commanding a scout platoon of the 2nd Battalion KRRC, the 60th, in Calais. On the evening of their arrival, the 60th began taking up defensive positions around the western half of the old perimeter fortifications, while the Rifle Brigade covered the eastern half, including the Gare Maritime and the main dock area. By nightfall, 3 RTR, severely weakened by the loss of 12 cruiser tanks at Guisnes earlier in the day, had withdrawn from their position on the Coquelle Ridge into the town, coming under the command of Brigadier Nicholson as part of 30 Brigade. Calais by this time was a very confused place. The docks had suffered numerous Stuka attacks, and the town was being shelled with increasing intensity. Despite this, throughout the day, refugees continued to enter the town seeking food and safe shelter, both of which were becoming increasingly difficult to find. For Brigadier Nicholson, too, confusion. The ships that had brought 30 Brigade from Dover that afternoon were still being unloaded late in the evening when a telephone call was received at Brigade headquarters from the Director of Military Operations and Plans, Major General Dewing, to the effect that Brigadier Nicholson should prepare for the evacuation of Calais.
A further complication arose in that a liaison officer arrived from headquarters British Expeditionary Force, and he changed all the orders and said that it wasn't a question of relieving Boulogne at all, that we were to hold Calais and we were to open up communications between Calais and Dunkirk, and in particular to get through, I think it was 350,000 rations that were sitting in Calais for the BEF, to get them through to Dunkirk, where they could be issued to the BEF.
B Squadron 3 RTR, now comprising 1 cruiser tank and 3 light tanks, was immediately ordered to secure the road to Gravelines and on to Dunkirk, ahead of the convoy of rations that was being hurriedly assembled at the docks.
This convoy was formed up of some 1,500 weights, and to my best recollection, there was about 2 to 3 Bren gun carriers, and a staff car, I think, was with it as well. I asked one of the NCOs where we were supposed to be going. He said, we're going to make a real dash, he said, to Dunkirk with rations. So I thought, well, that sounds interesting anyway, so off we eventually went. And we went through the deserted main streets until we got out onto the outskirts, and it was then that I started to get a bit suspicious about things as to how far away the enemy was. And one of the things that struck me was that all the streets were deserted, with the exception of this priest we came across, or we passed, who was coming along with about 6 rather sturdy-looking young lads in shorts with rucksacks on their back. And I thought, well, they're pretty old chaps for a priest to be sort of in care. And some of them obviously had been shaven as well by the growth. And I thought, after I passed them, I thought to myself, I bet they're 5th columnists.
The convoy had barely got beyond the outskirts of the town when it encountered enemy recce units and was obliged to withdraw. Nothing further was heard of the 4 tanks which had gone ahead to secure the Gravelines road.
And at this stage, I was sent for by the colonel and ordered to take a patrol of 2 light Mark 6B tanks back along the route that we had withdrawn to see if I could discover how far into the perimeter the Germans had penetrated. Now, this was interesting because, as far as I'm aware, I had never been trained in this, and none of us knew anything about patrolling in built-up areas with tanks. And at this time, one must remember that they made a tremendous clatter upon the cobbles that were the surface of the roads within the towns of France. Now, the streets of Calais at that time were extremely narrow, and I was extremely surprised when passing the Hôtel de Ville on the way to the Avenue Léon Gambetta to see something silver whistle past my head and hit the turret of the tank. I then realized, of course, that the high points in the town, like the tower of the Hôtel de Ville, the lighthouse and the old bell tower, had to be watched very carefully because they were ideal points for snipers. We pressed on, one tank either side of the road, until we got to the bridge which crosses the canal on the western side of the town, where we came under extremely heavy machine gun fire. We replied in kind without really knowing what we were shooting at, but it seemed silly to let them get away with it all.
About a mile and a half to the south of the bridge where the tank patrol came under fire, on the Frétin Road, where it runs beside the main railway line to Paris, Lieutenant Snowden and his platoon of QVRs spent a restless night manning their roadblock. Just before first light on Friday morning, the 24th of May, the platoon was stood to, as it had been for most of the night.
By the position, we had a signal box. Presumably it was doing all the points on the siding there. And it was a wonderful place for an OP. So I went up into this to see what was going on. First thing that happened was somebody had a shot at me. And when I went back to Calais in 1981, the hole was still in the glass. With first light, I suppose it was about 5:30, we saw coming down the road a column of grey figures, which we took to be military, and for some reason assumed that they were Dutch, because I think the Dutch uniforms are the same colour as the German ones. The last thing in our minds, I think, was that they should be Germans, which just shows how in the picture we were. However, when they came sufficiently close, it was quite clear they were Germans, and I had that wonderful position of giving the fire orders of bushy top tree, 200 yards, single rounds fire, and we let off, everyone let off at them, and they went down. I don't know, but they disappeared. Presumably, we couldn't have missed them. I suppose half an hour after that, we got the order to withdraw behind our road block at Les Fontinettes. And when we got to Les Fontinettes, we understood that all the QVR platoons had been placed under the command of the 60th and Rifle Brigade platoons, which had taken up their positions on the outer perimeter of the town. We took up a position on an embankment, and in the distance I saw a German air gun, I suppose it was. I was the only man in the platoon, I think, who had fired the boy's anti-tank rifle, and I did it on this occasion, deafening report. But the gun certainly didn't like it as it moved. And very shortly after that, I don't know what it was, but something went through my tin hat, and I was carried off to the rear.
Not far away from where Lieutenant Snowden's platoon had come under fire, from his position on Bastion 9 of the perimeter fortifications, 2nd Lieutenant Davis Schofield had a good view of the activity on his left flank that Friday morning, and by midday it was clear that an attack on his position was imminent.
And my company was deployed astride the Caquel Road, both sides of it, in fairly strong natural positions. We had C Company on our right, a bit of a gap between us, but they were up there between us and the sea, and I think it was D Company on our left, also a very large gap. These gaps had to be filled by mobile patrols. Although there was a certain amount of interlocking fire organised, the distances were very great. And one of my sections was employed throughout most of Friday, patrolling up and down, particularly between D Company and ourselves on the left, where the enemy were extremely active in the early part of the day. It's difficult, I think, to recapture in one's mind that really very exciting moment when the tanks came forward and one could see them manoeuvring amongst the gardens and the houses and presumably taking pot shots at us from behind cover there. Because there was a lot of artillery fire coming down, not so much on my platoon, but on my right and behind us where company headquarters was. And it was at this time that nearly all our soft-skinned vehicles, which had been tucked away in the streets behind, were in fact destroyed completely. I know that my company commander thought that the crisis of the battle had come, and he got some reinforcements sent up, and 2 little light tanks appeared. They bobbed up here, and they bobbed up there, and they fired. They hadn't got much more than a boy's rifle, except they were machine guns, 5.55, I think. And they didn't do much damage to the German tanks, but they certainly, by their presence, I think, caused the Germans to be even more cautious than they'd been before. My company commander had got 2 roadblocks across the road. They were pretty flimsy, really. They were whatever he could lay his hands on, and had been put up in a great hurry. They consisted of some civilian vehicles, lorries or vans, quite a lot of corrugated iron, some stones, I think, and rocks, and some wire from our vehicles, down at wire. But they were across the road and fairly flimsy, in fact, but they looked quite good. And these were covered by the 2-pounder guns, which had come up as well. But they didn't last at all when the tanks came up. One German tank, I remember, the only time one really came out into the open from behind the houses, suddenly appeared on the road, and in the space of a few seconds he'd shot both of the roadblocks to pieces. I can see now bits of these roadblocks jumping about each time he fired, and I understand also that they put both the 2-pounders out of action.
The overwhelming superiority of the Germans in manpower, artillery and armour was obvious to the defenders, but difficult for the Germans to confirm while they were still probing the perimeter defences of the town. Thus, no attack was pressed home with determination throughout the almost continuous action along the entire 60th Rifles front during the daylight hours of Friday the 24th of May. At the Gare Maritime, defended by 1st Battalion Rifle Brigade, injured men of the BEF who had arrived by train were embarked on the ships that had brought 30 Brigade to Calais the day before. These joined the garrison personnel considered to be non-essential to the immediate defence of the town, in accordance with Brigadier Nicholson's orders to prepare for the imminent evacuation of all British troops. The ships sailed during Friday morning, taking with them considerable quantities of 30 Brigade stores, vehicles and equipment which had not yet been offloaded. Even as this was happening, the Prime Minister was questioning the decision to evacuate Calais. Vice Chief of the Naval Staff informs me that an order was sent at 2 a.m. to Calais saying that evacuation was decided on in principle. But this is surely madness. The only effect of evacuating Calais would be to transfer the forces now blocking it to Dunkirk. Calais must be held for many reasons, but specially to hold the enemy on its front. During the afternoon, Brigadier Nicholson received orders countermanding the evacuation. Secret, stop. Personal, General Ironside to Brigadier Nicholson, stop. General Fagald appointed to command all Allied troops in North, stop. Fagald appoints you command Allied troops in Calais and forbids evacuation, stop. You will carry out this order in an active, not a passive manner, stop. Yours are all regular troops, and I need not say more, stop. For the defending forces, Friday the 24th of May, their first full day in the town, had been a long and tiring one.
I think our battle really began to die down in the early evening. My company commander was getting a bit restive. His main wireless link back to battalion headquarters had been completely destroyed when the vehicles were hit. There was fires raging in the houses behind us, and my company commander decided that he would go back into the town himself and contact battalion headquarters and get some orders.
At this crucial stage in the battle, with the enemy still unsure of the strength of the defending forces and the perimeter of the town firmly held by 30 Brigade, a serious breakdown in communications, both between flanking units and with brigade headquarters, allowed rumours of a withdrawal to the docks and the evacuation of Calais to go unchecked. When the commander of B Company, 60th Rifles, Jack Poole, got back to his unit late on Friday evening, the uncertainty had not been resolved.
Anyway, he said that the whole situation was very uncertain, that he understood that both the companies on our two flanks were withdrawing, that the battalion generally was going to take up positions further back, and he was going to withdraw, he thought, in conjunction with the two companies on our flank. I think if we'd really been able to contact the commanding officer, he would have told everybody to stay put. I don't know, but anyway, we did start planning a withdrawal, and when it got dusk, we started. And by this time, there were no vehicles except in my platoon. I had 6 carriers left, and I was told to cover the withdrawal, and back they all went on their feet, and we stayed behind until they were gone, and then we came back.
As B Company pulled back from their positions astride the Coquelle Road, C Company, to their right, were uncertain of their orders. Should they pull back in conformity, even though their positions had not been attacked? Second Lieutenant, later Colonel Philip Pardo, commanded C Company's scout platoon. He was given the job of finding out.
However, that night, I did have my first experience of what it was like in the town when the other companies of the battalion were ordered to withdraw to the inner perimeter of the town, and I was ordered to go and make contact with the company commander on our left, that was B Company commander, and to liaise with him in his new position. And that night, it made me realize how unpleasant conditions in a town can be when it's under shell fire from the enemy and under fire from snipers as well. Masonry can be falling at any time through shells landing on houses, where smoke and dust make visibility very bad, and where you have a problem with refugees, which were flocking into Calais from the countryside and which were blocking many of the streets. After I'd made contact with the second in command of the company on our left that night, I again realized another snag of when you're in built-up areas, which is once you've got slightly lost, you can be completely lost in a built-up area. Whereas in the open, you know where south is, you north, south, east, and west. You've got your field of fire. You've got certain obvious landmarks in front of you. In the town, one street looks the same as another, if it's strange to you, that town. And I had a bad 20 minutes when I reckoned I was completely lost.
The withdrawal, in darkness through the narrow streets, with the town continuing to be bombarded by the German artillery, was a confused affair.
In the early hours of the morning, there were several Stuka raids on the docks area, and there was a huge pall of oily smoke above the docks. More buildings were burning. The streets were extremely difficult to drive through. There were telegraph wires right across the street, buildings, piles of rubble, and it was a complete shambles. I had to drive Brigadier Nicholson to the Citadel on the morning of the 25th, and he had decided that it would be better to withdraw his headquarters into the Citadel. I was very impressed with the look of the place, and I drove across a drawbridge into a large courtyard. It looked a pretty impregnable place.
30 Brigade's new defence line was now concentrated on the Old Town, its network of basins and canals providing a substantial obstacle to any further enemy advance. The dock area and the sand dunes beyond continued to be held by 1st Battalion Rifle Brigade, while the 60th Rifles, with the exception of C Company, holding fast on the cliffs to the west of the town, now concentrated on the defence of the bridges linking the Old Town to the rest of Calais.
Although we looked nice on on the sketches and on the maps. We were not really in very strong positions. We had none of the things that you need for defending in built-up areas, or indeed of defending any position. We had, first of all, no artillery support at all. There were 2 destroyers off Calais, certainly 1 and sometimes 2 all the time, and they were able to provide some defensive and counter-battery fire for us, but it was very inaccurate because of the smoke and the dust over Calais, and their spotter planes that they were using, Swordfish, were very vulnerable to the German Air Force, and anyway couldn't see frightfully well, and it was pretty blind shooting. It was a help. But we had no artillery of our own, which I'm sure to a modern soldier must seem extraordinary, really, to have a position with no defensive fire down round you at all. We had, almost worse, we had no engineer stores. We had no wire, a few strands from off which we carried on our vehicles, but nothing serious at all. No mines, no explosives with which to blow the bridges, no explosives with which to make our houses and cellars and positions strong at all, and no sandbags, which of course are terribly important. I mean, if you want to put soldiers firing out of windows, you want to sandbag the windows, and they're very vulnerable indeed if you don't.
The only thing we could do was to venture out in sorties, perhaps 2 or 3 tanks together, and try and destroy targets that were bothering to rifle them. And these were mostly anti-tank guns and tanks. That we none of us had trained with the infantry in this role in defending built-up areas. We had no means of communication with the infantry other than by screaming out of the top of the turret. They had no means of attracting our attention other than waving their arms in front of us and pointing in the direction in which they wished us to fire.
Second Lieutenant, later Captain Peter Fraser, commanded a platoon of the 60th Rifles manning a makeshift roadblock on one of the bridges linking Old Calais with the rest of the town.
Quite early in the morning, after what would have been breakfast, a German sniper opened up from the top of the Hotel de Ville. This created a storm of machine gun fire from our machine gun posts. It's quite a natural reaction. When you're waiting under tension, increasing tension, you want to do something. Some bastard shoots at you from up the top, you do something. I was, however, dispatched very quickly by the commanding officer to tell the posts not to disclose their positions and not to waste ammunition, not to fire against, in fact, an invisible target. Then, well, things gradually hotted up after that. The shelling began and the mortaring began, and it seemed to me that it practically never stopped until well after dark. The effect of this onslaught of fire was to set all that part of the old city round me, set it alight. It was at midnight, I remember noticing that it was as light, if not lighter then, than it was at midday. A side effect of the destruction of part of the city was a great deal of brick dust got floating about in the atmosphere. This had caused a stoppage for which we were quite unprepared in our Bren guns, because brick dust got into the piston block, and they had to be taken out and stripped and cleaned. We were being in a city, just near a cafe, because I found myself a pat of butter with which I was cleaning the piston block, when a kindly sergeant, with that look of utter contempt that the sergeant has for a young officer trying to do something with a weapon, particularly and come taking it to pieces, said, "Give me that, sir." That saved my life, because I changed places with him. I found myself behind a wheel of a truck, and the poor sergeant was between, so to speak, wheels. And snipers started very effectively. And one of them, by just firing under the truck from 200 or 300 yards away, I suppose, killed the sergeant. In fact, they killed the 19 of us who manned that barricade, 3 of us lived, one losing sight of one eye and being shot through the arm.
I was told by the sergeant to take up a position on the side of the canal behind a bollard there with my direction of fire over towards the streets that led down from the town to the quayside and the station. And it was whilst we were there during the day that the Marines came ashore with the purpose of blowing up the little iron bridge that connected the station with the main part of the town. By this time, there were a hell of a lot of refugees had gathered, and they were a motley crowd. There was women and children and old men, but amongst them was obviously people that were odd bods, they were, because they were able-bodied and pretty well fit-looking. And the company commanders gave the order to our chaps on the other side of the bridge not to let these people come across. And there was a lot of arguing and shouting, and the women were screaming. And eventually, our company commander, who had now taken over second in command, taken over command of the troops in Calais, gave the order to blow the bridge.
The Germans maintained their remorseless mortar and artillery bombardment throughout the morning of Saturday the 25th of May. From his new headquarters within the moated ramparts of the citadel, Brigadier Nicholson could have little doubt that without substantial reinforcements, without any artillery support whatsoever, without fresh water, which had all but disappeared, the ability of 30 Brigade to continue its defence of the town could now be numbered not in days, but hours. At midday, the bombardment ceased as enemy aircraft flew low overhead, dropping leaflets demanding that the garrison surrender or be bombed out. At the same time, German envoys were sent under a white flag to the citadel bearing the same surrender demand. Brigadier Nicholson's reply is recorded in the war diary of the German 10th Armoured Division. The answer is no, as it is the British Army's duty to fight as well as it is the Germans. The bombardment of the old town was resumed with unparalleled ferocity. Shortly before all radio and telephone communications were destroyed, Brigadier Nicholson received this message from the War Office, dictated by the Prime Minister. Defence of Calais to the utmost is of highest importance to our country as symbolising our continued cooperation with France. The eyes of the Empire are upon the defence of Calais, and His Majesty's government confident you and your gallant regiments will perform an exploit worthy of the British name. Saturday, the 25th of May, ended much as it had begun. The inner defensive line held firm, despite continuous artillery and mortar bombardment, the Germans all the time consolidating their hold on the remainder of the town. With first light on Sunday, the Stukas returned.
I heard the noise of aircraft in the air, and being an optimist, I said, hooray, the Royal Air Force are coming. Then I saw 54 aircraft flying in 3 groups of 18. They were German dive bombers, as we soon discovered. They broke up into wings of flights of 3, and one flight took on my bridge.
After the Stukas, the mortaring again began in earnest.
And at one point, I saw a mortar shell burst about 30 yards in front of me. A minute later, another mortar shell burst about 30 yards behind me. I pointed out to a senior officer, Major called Godfrey Cromwell, that the odds were that in about 55 seconds it would land, the next one would land on him and me. And if we retreated 50 yards, we could cover the bridge still. So he agreed, and we retreated 50 yards, bringing back the few who were alive that we had with us. There, to our horror, we found ourselves enfiladed by a German tank, which had succeeded in knocking out the garrison of the bridge on our right and crossing it, the first of many German tanks.
To me, I think the most unpleasant aspects of fighting in the town were, firstly, the effect of shell fire landing on buildings, which instead of, as in the open country, a crump and a shell lands, and that's it, it involves masonry coming tumbling down, slates falling off roofs, dust in the streets, smoke everywhere, houses on fire, and this blinds you from other members of your section, your platoon, and in any case, in the town, it's very easy to get quickly disorientated. There was a mass of refugees pouring one way and the other, really like a sort of flock of sheep, not knowing where to go to escape from the Germans. And, of course, completely blocking that one's field of fire.
The positions that 30 Brigade held on to so tenaciously throughout Friday and Saturday had, on Sunday morning, begun to give way. C Company's 60th Rifles had finally been driven from their long-held positions on the cliffs, and as they fell back toward the docks, German troops were consolidating footholds gained in the old town under cover of their advancing tanks. The last message to reach the beleaguered citadel was landed by boat from one of the minesweepers patrolling the waters just a few hundred yards from the beaches of Calais. Every hour you continue to exist is of greatest help to the BEF. Government has therefore decided you must continue to fight. Have the greatest possible admiration for your splendid stand. The splendid stand was, however, all but over. By midday on Sunday, the 26th of May, Brigade headquarters could no longer coordinate the defence. Around the Gare Maritime, the Rifle Brigade fought on in an increasingly desperate rearguard action. While in the Old Town, companies of the 60th Rifles held out in isolation. Second Lieutenant Davis Schofield was at this time acting second in command of B Company, occupying houses in the vicinity of the Place de Norvège.
When I got back into company headquarters, I found that a lot of casualties had been carried in there, and there were people saying that the Germans were right round us. And my company commander, I suppose by this time it must have been into the afternoon, my company commander, again, was a very stalwart person. He'd been in the First War, he'd got a DSO and an OB and an MC, and highly decorated and very brave chap. He said, you stay here and take command of the company, I must find out what's happening, because we're out of touch with everybody. And we all tried to persuade him not to go, and some of us offered to go instead, you know. But no, he said, it's my job to go, and you stay here. And he hadn't been gone very long when we suddenly found that we started seeing Germans in the streets. In fact, what had happened was the Germans had overrun the companies in the centre. And the commanding officer had decided that further resistance was impossible, and he had done his level best to get around and tell people to package in and to break up into small parties and to try and make one's way through the lines. They were very good, clever and capable, the Germans. They went from crossroads to crossroads and established themselves at each crossroads, put down machine guns and so on and so forth.
The final moments of the battle for Calais were fought close by the quays of the Gare Maritime, where the men of 30 Brigade had landed, most of them, just 3 days before, and from where now all seaworthy craft, large and small, had departed. There were a few, very few, who managed to escape. But for the rest of 30 Brigade who survived, 5 long years in German prisoner of war camps lay ahead. A significant factor at Calais, as in all FIBUA actions, was the density of buildings, especially in the narrow streets of the Old Town. Whilst imposing limited observation on both sides, the buildings made the German commanders overcautious, because they were unable to assess the true strength of the defending forces. However, fighting in built-up areas also imposes disadvantages on the defender, which were very apparent in Calais. The difficulty of passing orders frequently led to confusion and rumour. Short fields of fire made it difficult to provide effective mutual support in the final stages of the battle. Incendiarism, one burning building rapidly spreading the fire to others, forced evacuation of strongpoints. Civilians, and especially refugees, posed difficult problems of control and enabled infiltration by enemy snipers and fifth columnists. The defence of Calais not only helped to delay the German advance long enough to allow the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk at the beginning of June 1940, but also led to a new awareness of the need for thorough training in the techniques of fighting in built-up areas.